She was making biscuits when they knocked, not making them from a mix, from scratch. The way she had been making them since she was 11 years old, and her grandmother had put her hands over hers at the counter and said, "Feel when the dough is right. You don't need to see it." Flour and shortening and buttermilk, the proportions held in her hands after 68 years, measured by touch and weight, and the specific sound the dough made when it was ready to be turned. Her kitchen was small and she knew every inch of it. The cast iron skillet was where it always was. The oven ran about 10 degrees hot, and she compensated for it the way she had been compensating for it since 1987. The knock came at the door, and she wiped her hands and went to it without hurrying, because she did not hurry, and she opened it. She said yes. She could not see the 5 men standing on her porch. She could not see the motorcycles at the end of her walk, rain wet and mud splattered from 40 miles of unpaved county road. She could not see the jackets, or the patches, or the size of the men, or the way the smallest of them was still a full head taller than she was. She stood in her doorway at 4'11", with flour on her hands and her face tilted slightly upward the way she tilted it when she was listening, and she waited to hear what they had come to say. The man nearest the door said, "Ma'am, we're sorry to bother you. We've got a bike down about a mile back, and the rain's coming in hard, and we were wondering if we could use your phone." She listened to the rain on the porch roof for a moment. She said, "I don't have a phone that works." She paused. She said, "But I have biscuits in the oven and a pot of soup on the stove, and you sound cold. Coming out of the rain." The farmhouse sat at the end of Cutter Road in Hargrove County, North Carolina, 3 miles from the nearest paved surface and 11 miles from the nearest town. It had been built in 1934 by a man named Wallace Pace and had been in some version of the Pace family ever since. The nearest neighbor was a mile east, and the neighbor after that was the county road. The mailbox at the end of the drive was the kind that shows the distance from everything else, and the drive itself was red clay in dry weather and something else in rain, and the house at the end of it sat in a stand of old pines that had been old when Wallace Pace built around them. The house was modest and it was kept. The porch boards were sound. The windows were clean in the way of windows washed regularly by someone who cannot see whether they are clean but keeps them clean, because that is what you do. The garden along the east side of the house had gone mostly to seed in October, but the bones of it were careful, the rows still visible, the border stones still in their places, a late kale still going in the corner where it always went. Inside, the kitchen was the warmest room, which it had always been, which is why a woman named Eunice Pace, who was 83 years old and had been blind since 61, had arranged her life around it. She had lost her sight to a degenerative condition that the doctors had named and tracked and been unable to stop. It had taken 11 years from first diagnosis to complete darkness. And in those 11 years, she had done 2 things. She had learned everything she needed to learn about living without sight, methodically and without self-pity. And she had reorganized her house so that every object was where she knew it was. The cups were where the cups were. The cast iron was where the cast iron was. The table was where the table had been for 50 years, and the chairs were where the chairs had been, and the door from the kitchen to the hall was 11 steps from the stove, which she knew because she had counted it before the dark came fully, and she had been counting it ever since. Her husband, Gerald, had died 17 years ago. Her daughter lived in Charlotte and called on the first Sunday of the month. Her son was in the Navy and called when he could, which was not often. She had a neighbor, Mrs. Hawkins, who stopped in on Thursdays, and a woman from the county senior services office who had been assigned to her case and came on the second Tuesday of every month, or had until 6 months ago when the visits had stopped and no one had explained why. She managed. She was not a woman who called for help. She was a woman who organized her life so that help was rarely needed, and when it was needed, she found a way to do without it, and on the days when doing without was not possible, she sat at the kitchen table and was still until it was. She had $31 in the house. She had a can of soup. She had been saving some flour and shortening and buttermilk for biscuits, 4 eggs, half an onion, and a heel of bread. She had been planning to make the soup last 3 days, with biscuits the first day because she was tired, and biscuits were comfort, and she was 73 days from her next check. She had been planning all of this when the knock came. She had opened the door and heard the rain and heard the voice of a cold man. And she had done what her mother and her grandmother and every woman on Cutter Road before her had done when someone cold came to the door. She had invited him in. If you're new here, Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where this story reaches, because what Eunice Pace did when 5 cold strangers knocked on her door, and what she said when the soup pot was empty, is something you are going to want to share with every person you know. Stay with me. Her name was Eunice Pace, and she was 83 years old, and she had been born in this house, and she intended to die in it. She had met Gerald at a church social in 1962 and married him in 1964 in the front room of this house and raised 2 children in this house in 2007, and she had been here every year and every season, and she knew the sound of the rain on every part of the roof and the feel of the floorboards in every room and the smell of the pines when the wind came from the east. She did not experience her blindness as deprivation. She experienced it as a different set of instructions for the same life. She had taught school for 22 years, history and civics at the county middle school, and she still had opinions about both subjects and was not shy about them. She had been the president of the Hargrove County Library Friends for 11 years. She had opinions about pie that she would defend at length. She still listened to the radio every evening, the news and then music, sitting in the chair by the window that faced east, which was the direction the light came from in the mornings, and which she still sat facing out of a habit so old she no longer thought about it. She had one small, dignified ritual that she had maintained without interruption since Gerald died. She set the table with a cloth for every meal, not a paper cloth. The white cotton cloth her mother had given her, ironed, corner to corner, even when she was eating alone, even when she was eating crackers because it was the end of the month. Gerald had always said that a meal eaten at a properly set table was a meal worth eating, and she had decided in the year after he died that she agreed with him and that she would go on acting like it regardless. For 5 cold strangers in motorcycle jackets whom she could not see, she set the table with the cloth. Their names were Joe, Marcus, Phil, Denny, and a man everyone called Stretch, who was 6'6" and had to angle himself to get through her kitchen door, which he did apologetically, and who sat at the end of the table with his knees at an awkward angle and was scrupulously careful about it. They were from the Asheville chapter, and they had been riding toward a memorial run when the rain had come in harder than forecast, and Phil's rear tire had given out on a county road with no shoulders and no signal. Joe Alvarado was the one who had knocked. He was 46 years old, and he had been riding 20 years, and he had knocked on a farmhouse door in the rain because it was the only farmhouse door on 3 miles of county road, and he had done it without any clear expectation, the way you knock on a door when you have no other option. He had heard the biscuits, not seen them, not been told about them, heard them. The specific crackle of cast iron in an oven that ran hot and the smell that came through the door when the woman opened it, and he had understood in the same moment that she was blind, and that she was cooking, and that she had just invited him inside before she knew who he was or what he looked like. He went in. The other 4 came in behind him. She set 5 places with the efficiency of a woman who has set tables in the dark for over 20 years. The cloth straight and the bowls where the bowls went, and the biscuits out of the oven and the soup ladled and the bread sliced. And the 5 of them sat around her table in their wet jackets, and she sat at the head of it, and she asked Joe where they were headed. And he told her, and she told him about the memorial run her husband's brother had organized in 1987, and how she had ridden on the back of the bike until the year before she lost her sight, and they ate. They ate all of it. They ate the soup and the biscuits and the bread, and Joe watched the pot get low and looked at the counter and the shelf above the stove, and he saw how things stood, and he understood what he was eating. He waited until the meal was over. He said, "Mrs. Pace, can I ask you something?" He said, "The soup and the biscuits, did you have plans for those?" A pause. She turned her face toward him slightly, that particular tilt of attention. She said, "I was going to stretch it a few days." Joe was quiet. She said, "Don't." He said, "Ma'am, I've been feeding people at this table since before you were born, and I'll go on doing it as long as I can, and that's all there is to it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He helped her clear the table. He washed the bowls while Denny dried and Phil put them away under her direction. 3rd shelf, left of the window. 2 from the end. And Stretch sat at the table because the kitchen was not built for Stretch to move around in, and Marcus stood in the hall and made a call on the signal he'd found by the east window, the one Eunice sat by in the evenings. He called a man named Del Fogarty, who was the chapter's road captain, who answered on the 2nd ring. Marcus told him about the county road and the farmhouse and the meal. He told him about the shelf above the stove. He told him about the cloth on the table. Del Fogarty was quiet for a moment. He said, "Signal's bad down that road." Marcus said, "Right up to the house." Del said, "I'll make calls." Marcus said, "How many can you reach by morning?" He said, "Be there by 9. Marcus said, "It's 40 miles of county road." Del said, "I know what it is." A man from the auto shop in town brought his truck out and pulled Phil's bike behind his shop, which he opened at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday, because Del had called him the night before. The tire was replaced by 8:15, and Phil was back on his bike before 9. The 5 of them had slept in the farmhouse, 3 in the spare room, Joe on the couch, Stretch on the floor of the front room, because the couch was not built for his dimensions and he was fine on the floor, and said so. Eunice had made coffee at 6 and eggs at 7, and she had moved through her kitchen in the dark the way she always moved through it, certain and unhurried, and they had sat at the table with the cloth and eaten breakfast. Joe had been awake since 5. He had sat in the kitchen before Eunice came down, in the dark because it didn't occur to him to turn the light on, and he had thought about the shelf above the stove and the counter and the heel of bread that was gone and what the next 3 days would have been before they had knocked. He had thought about a woman who set the table with a cloth when she was eating alone at the end of the month. He had thought about what it cost to give that table away and how she had given it without calculation before she knew who was standing in her door, because someone was cold and it was raining and there was soup on the stove. He was still sitting there when Eunice came in at 6, and she heard him and said, "You couldn't sleep either." He said, "I slept fine. I just wanted to sit in your kitchen." She said, "Gerald used to do that." She moved to the stove. He said the kitchen was the only room in the house that had a personality. Joe said, "He was right." She said, "He usually was. Don't tell him I said that." She said it the way people say things about the dead that they would have said to their face. And Joe said, "I won't." And neither of them said anything else for a while, which was the right amount. At 8:53 in the morning, Eunice Pace was on her porch. She was there because Joe had said, "Why don't you sit out front for a bit?" And she had said, "It's October." And he had said, "I know, but it's clear today." And she had brought her coat and sat in the chair she kept on the porch and listened to the pines. She heard it before she understood it. It began as a change in the air, the particular pressure shift that precedes something large, the way weather changes a room before the rain arrives. Then it became a sound, low at first and directional, coming from the end of Cutter Road, where the road met the county route, and she turned her face that direction and listened. It built. The sound of it came down the 3 miles of red clay and pine, and it was not one sound but 1,000 variations of the same sound, low and even and purposeful and enormous. And it came the way a river comes when the banks are closed, gathered and moving, and it filled the October morning of Hargrove County entirely, and there was nothing else. Eunice Pace put both hands on the arms of her chair. The sound kept coming. She heard them reach the drive, the change in the engine note as they turned from the road, the way the sound multiplied and clarified when it had the pines on both sides. And she stood up from the chair, which she had not planned to do, which her body did before her mind did. And she held the porch railing with both hands and she listened. 703 motorcycles came down Cutter Road. They came in formation, 2 by 2, where the road allowed in single file where it did not, and the sound of them was a physical thing. She felt it in the boards beneath her feet, in the railing under her hands, in the air against her face. They filled the drive and the road in both directions, and some pulled onto the grass verge and some stayed on the road, and none of them were in any hurry. They came until they stopped. And when 703 engines cut, the silence was the largest silence Eunice Pace had ever heard. She stood at the railing with her hands wrapped around it, and she listened to that silence, which was not the silence of absence, but the silence of 703 people choosing not to speak, which is a different thing entirely. Joe came to stand beside her on the porch. She said, "How many?" He said, 703 so far. She was quiet. She said, "For you." Her hands tightened on the railing. She did not speak for a moment. The pines moved in the October air, and the chrome in the drive caught the morning light that came from the east, the direction she always sat facing, and she could not see any of it, and she did not need to. She said, Gerald would have loved this. Joe said, "Tell me about Gerald." She said, "Later. First I want to just—" She stopped. She lifted her face toward the sound of 703 people standing in her drive in the morning. "I want to just hear it." Del Fogarty had made 14 calls the night before. Those 14 calls had gone out through 4 chapters and 2 states and a veterans riders group and a Christian motorcyclists organization out of Brevard that had called Del directly at 10:30 and asked if they could come. Del had said it was more than all right. People had ridden through the night from Charlotte and Asheville and Hendersonville and Boone and 3 counties whose names Eunice Pace would have recognized because she had taught their geography to 7th graders for 22 years. They had also brought things, not organized, not coordinated, brought the way people bring things when a specific story lands in a specific place and they reach for what they have. Grocery bags. A man from the Hendersonville chapter with a truck of firewood and a new weather seal for the front door he'd seen in photographs Joe had sent. A woman named Rita with 4 casseroles and a cooler and the specific kind of cookies she made for everyone she cared about. By 9 o'clock, 3 people had reached a supervisor at County Senior Services who had decided to be part of the solution. The caseworker who had marked Eunice's file stable without a visit in 6 months was reassigned. A new coordinator came to Cutter Road that afternoon and sat at the table with the cloth and made the kind of notes that get things done. Eunice stood on the porch for a long time that morning. Joe stood beside her and told her what he could see. Not everything, because there was too much of it, but the things that seemed most worth saying. The bikes lined up the drive and down the road. The people standing beside them. The truck with the firewood. Rita with the cooler. Del Fogarty making his way up the drive, which was some distance which he covered without rushing. Del came up the porch steps and he took off his helmet and he held it under his arm and he said, "Mrs. Pace, Del Fogarty, Asheville chapter. Joe tells me you fed 5 of my people last night." Eunice said, "I fed 5 cold men who knocked on my door." Del said, "Yes, ma'am. He also told me how things stood in the kitchen." Eunice said, "He shouldn't have told you that." "He told me anyway." He paused. "We've got some groceries we'd like to leave with you, if you'll allow it, and some firewood, and a few other things." Eunice was quiet. She said, "I don't take charity." Del said, "This isn't charity." She said, "What is it then?" He said, "You set a table for 5 strangers in the rain with everything you had. We'd like to set it back." He paused. "Call it what you want." The morning was cold and bright, and the sound of 700 people in her drive was the sound of something that had no name she knew. And her hands were on the railing, and she was 83 years old, and she had been born in this house, and she intended to die in it, and no one was taking anything from her, and the table was already set. She said, "The firewood goes around the back left side of the house. Gerald always kept it left side." Del said, "Left side." She said, "The groceries go in the kitchen. I'll tell you where things go." Del said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And the woman with the casseroles." Del said, "Rita. Tell Rita I said thank you, and I'll return the dishes." "She won't expect them back." Eunice said, "I know she won't." She turned her face toward the drive, toward the sound of 700 people in the October morning. "Tell her I'll return them anyway." The county coordinator came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after, and stopped needing to schedule them because she had become someone Eunice expected. The grocery delivery was reinstated, the subsidy restored. A woman named June from the Christian Riders Group lived 12 miles away and started coming on Thursdays because the drive was short and the coffee at 14 Cutter Road was good and the conversation was better. Joe drove out from Asheville 3 weeks later with Phil and Stretch, and they fixed the weather seal, rehung the garden gate, cleared the gutters, and stayed for lunch. Eunice made soup from a pot that was full and set the table with the cloth, and they ate. And Joe told her what Gerald would have seen from the porch that morning, and she listened with her face tilted toward him and her hands still on the table. Stretch angled himself through the kitchen door again. She heard it and said, "You're very tall." He said, Gerald was 5'7". Never once let it bother him. Stretch said, "Smart man." She said, "The smartest." She picked up her spoon. though he was terrible at chess. Joe drove home in the late afternoon, south on the county road and then west on the highway. And he thought about a kitchen he had sat in before dawn with no light on because it hadn't occurred to him to turn it on. And a woman moving through that kitchen with a certainty that had nothing to do with sight. He thought about the cloth on the table. He thought, "You fed us everything you had, and you told us not to make it a thing. You have been feeding people at that table since before we were born, and you will go on doing it, and that is all there is to it." That was all there was to it. He gave the highway what it wanted, and the October evening came down around the mountains. And behind him, on Cutter Road, in a kitchen with a cast-iron skillet and a pot on the stove, and everything in its place, a woman set the table with a white cotton cloth ironed corner to corner, and sat down to eat, and the chair at the other end of the table was empty the way it had been empty for 17 years. And the chair at the other end of the table was not empty at all. Some people spend their whole lives giving from tables that are already running low, and they do not call it sacrifice. They call it what you do when someone is cold and knocking. There are people in this world who have been feeding strangers since before you were born, who set the table with a cloth even when they are eating alone, who give you everything they have and tell you not to make it a thing. They deserve a morning when 700 engines come down the road for them. They deserve to stand at the railing and feel it in their hands. If this story reached you, if you know someone who has been giving quietly from a table that doesn't have enough, share it with them tonight. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop your city in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone who fed people when they didn't have to, who gave without counting, type Cutter Road in the comments. I read every single one,